Welcome to the 2020 ASPPH Virtual Annual Meeting. I hope you are all staying well during these challenging times. I'm Laura Magaña, President and CEO of ASPPH, and I'm excited to announce that our in-person annual meeting has gone virtual to support the continuous commitment and engagement of our public health community in the local response to the coronavirus, and in line with our collective responsibility to protect and promote the health and well-being of all, while we stay connected and networking as a community. ASPPH virtual annual meeting after this week's kickoff program will be held on Fridays until May 15th, featuring key speakers and selected sessions, and I hope all of you can join the conversations. Each session is being recorded and will be available on our website. Today, our plenary session is Ameliorating Poverty and Inequality Must Be Central to Public Health, with Professor Sir Michael Marmot, and I'm pleased to introduce today's session moderator, Dr. Sandro Galea, Chair of the ASPPH Board of Directors and Dean of Boston University School of Public Health. Welcome, Dean Galea, and now I will turn the session over to you to introduce our presenter.
Thank you, Dr. Magaña. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. We, as Laura mentioned, the session is about poverty and inequality is central to public health. When we arranged this session, it was we had anticipated meeting in person to discuss this, and I think we're discussing topics that are at the very heart of what we care about in public health. And I know we're in a moment of COVID when we are talking about COVID all the time, and perhaps there has been no time where it's been more important to talk about poverty and inequality than it is right now. The consequences of COVID, apart from the infectious consequences, are going to be largely social and economic, and they're largely driven by and patterned by health gaps. So I'm actually very excited about today's talk, and I think if it was at all possible, it's even more relevant now than it was when we first planned it. For this presentation and discussion, we are truly fortunate to have perhaps the world's most distinguished authority on thinking about health gaps, Sir Michael Marmot. Briefly, Sir Michael Marmot has been professor at University College London since 1985. He has authored what I consider to be the seminal books in the field, including The Health Gap and Status Syndrome, coming in 2015 and 10 years before that. He has had, he's been an advisor to WHO Director General on Social Determinants of Health for a long time, and has chaired the Commission on Social Determinants of Health, which really, to my mind, changed the conversation, changed the global conversation on thinking about social determinants and social determinants of health. He has been, I could go on with his accomplishments, but I want to make this brief. He's been a member of the Royal Commission on Environmental Pollution. He was knighted by Her Majesty the Queen in 2000 for his services to epidemiology and understanding of health inequalities. And he's also an elected member of the National Academy of Medicine. I'm delighted to have Sir Michael Marmot with us. The format is that Sir Michael will speak for about half an hour, and then him and I will engage in discussion. I would be delighted to take questions from the audience, which I will pose to Sir Michael, and to have everybody as engaged as much as possible. Michael, over to you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to do this. It would be even more of a pleasure if we could all be there together, but let's do it this way. I'm going to talk primarily about a report that we published in the UK 3 weeks ago, because firstly, I'd like to think it's important, but secondly, I think it has great implications for the United States and other countries, and it relates to this heading of social justice, social determinants of health, and health equity. The hashtag Marmot 2020 actually summed up what the report was about. And if you look at that hashtag, you can see some of the interest that we seem to have generated. In my book, The Health Gap, the opening lines were, why treat people and send them back to the conditions that made them sick? Various people have come up with estimates of the contribution of the health care system to the health of the population. A recent European estimate said perhaps 10%, the remainder being the social determinants of health. And it was to that end, as Sandro said in introducing me, that I chaired the WHO Commission on Social Determinants of Health. And then in the wake of the WHO Commission, I was invited by the British government to answer the question, how could we apply the recommendations of the Global Commission for one country, England? And we published the so-called Marmot Review in 2010. And what I'll talk about for most of the rest of this is what we've just done as a 10-year follow-up to the Marmot Review, which we published on the 25th of February. But I then did the European Review of Social Determinants and the Health Divide for the European region of WHO. And on the 1st of October last year, we published the Commission of the Pan-American Health Organization on Equity and Health Inequalities in the Americas. And this was our report in February, Health Equity in England, the Marmot Review 10 years on. The picture is not a good one. The first bit of background and an important part of our report is what has happened to life expectancy. I show you figures here from 1980, but if I had a big enough screen, I'd go back to 1890. From the end of the 19th century, life expectancy increased about 1 year every 4 years. And then in 2010-11, that stopped and it virtually ground to a halt. And you can see this dramatic change in the curve. What happened in 2010-11 to account for the fact that life expectancy stopped increasing? And when we look at inequalities, poverty is in the title of this session, but as many of you will know, inequalities in health are not confined to poor health for the poor, but there's a social gradient. This graph is based on deprivation of the area of residence, and you can see for males and females, the less deprived, the higher the life expectancy. The gap for males is bigger than for females. And it's been increasing from 2010 to 2018, the gap increased by nearly a year. So the gradient is getting steeper. And it's not just years of life, but healthy life. The top graph shows the gradient in life expectancy. The bottom graph is the gradient in healthy life expectancy. And the horizontal line is pension age, which is being increased from 65 to 68. And you can see that the gradient for healthy life expectancy is steeper than the gradient for life expectancy. And something like 2/3 of the population do not have healthy life expectancy as long as 68. It means by getting people to work longer, people either have to work with disability or they'll be on some kind of disability benefit instead of a pension. This has huge economic implications. And if we look at life spent in good health, look at years in poor health for males, the years spent in poor health went up. And for females, the years spent in poor health went up. So healthy life expectancy actually went down marginally for females. And we've been looking at region as well as deprivation. And the figures are really quite interesting. And there are similar figures have been produced for the United States. Look first at the least deprived 10%. Each one of those different lines is a different region of England. If you are in the least deprived decile, it doesn't much matter where in the country you live, and life expectancy was improving. Now look at the most deprived decile. It matters enormously where you are. The regional differences are huge for people in the bottom decile. And life expectancy, this is women, was improving for women in the most deprived decile in London, a tiny bit in the Northwest, but in every other region, life expectancy for women in the most deprived decile was going down. So 3 findings: flattening of the improvement in life expectancy, increase in inequalities, and worsening life expectancy for women in the bottom decile. And this is illustrating my point. If you compare the London region, the top pair, with the Northeast, for the least deprived 10%, there's really no difference between London and the Northeast. The greater the deprivation, the bigger the difference between London and the Northeast. And life expectancy was going up for women in London and going down for women at the bottom decile in the Northeast. I said I think our findings have implications for the US. As you will know well, life expectancy declined 3 years in a row in the US. So we've had a slowdown in the UK. You actually had a decline in the average. And the reason that I put this in here, the mind is an important gateway by which social determinants affect ill health, because as you will know, a big contribution to that decline in life expectancy in the US are so-called deaths of despair, poisonings, suicide, and alcohol-related deaths. And the mind is an important gateway because of its implications for mental illness and well-being, and psychosocial pathways to physical illness through behaviors and stress pathways. And if we look at what's been happening to inequalities in the US, this is life expectancy at age 50 for men by year of birth. So if you look at men who were born in 1920, you see the social gradient, deciles of income. And then men born in 1950, life expectancy for the poorest 10% hardly went up. It went up a bit more for the next 10%. And the richer people were, the bigger the increase. The gradient got steeper, the inequalities got much bigger. That's men. Women, life expectancy went down in the bottom 10%, in the second decile, went down in the third decile. For the bottom 30% of the income distribution, life expectancy for women age 50 decreased. And then the bigger your income, the bigger the increase. A dramatic steepening of the gradient, increase in inequalities. So on both sides of the Atlantic, we're facing the same kind of picture, perhaps more extreme in the US than in England, but a similar picture. The question is why? In my 2010 report, we had 6 policy objectives which represented our synthesis of the evidence of the causes of health inequalities. And based on that evidence of the causes, we laid out policy recommendations. So the 6 were: give every child the best start in life, education and lifelong learning, employment and working conditions. The 4th one was everyone should have at least the minimum income necessary for a healthy life. The 5th was creating healthy and sustainable places in which to live and work. And the 6th one was taking a social determinants approach to prevention. In our 10 years on review, we focused on what had happened in the first 5. We said less about the 6th, not because it's unimportant, because of this phenomenon. These data from England look at how much a household would have to spend if they followed the healthy eating advice. In the bottom decile, household would have to spend 74% of household income on food if they followed the healthy eating advice. If you are of the persuasion that people only have themselves to blame if they behave badly, then you need to look at these data. How can you expect people to follow the advice about fruit and vegetables and Mediterranean diet and the like if they would have to spend 74% of household income on food? If they did that, who would pay the rent? Our approach was that by taking action on the other 5 domains, you would make it easier for people to adopt healthy lifestyle. So let's look at what happened over the 10 years. In 2009-10, the government spent 42% of national income in public expenditure, 42% of GDP. By 2018-19, that 42 had gone down to 35%. So this was a political decision to spend less public money. And the obvious question, did that rolling back of the state contribute to the worse health picture that we saw? Let's look at local government. We've got quintiles of deprivation. In the poorest 20% of areas, overall, spending per person in local government went down by 32%. In the least deprived 20%, it went down by 16%. And it was neatly regressive. Have you ever seen anything so neatly regressive? The poorer the local area, the greater the need, but the bigger the reduction in spending. On the assumption, and it's not such a dangerous assumption, on the assumption that some of that spending by local government was improving the quality of people's lives, and that you need to spend more in more deprived areas, it would be hardly surprising if that regressive nature of spending by local government had adverse effects on health inequalities. Now, the government pursued austerity because they said it was the way to get economic growth. Regrettably, it didn't work. This is the growth of wages between 2007 and 2018 for the rich countries of the world. Greece did the worst, Mexico next, and then the UK with negative wage growth. So to justify austerity because we needed to get economic growth, well, we didn't. What happened to children? Housing makes a big contribution to poverty. So we've got poverty here before and after housing costs. And poverty is defined as less than 60% of median income. Children in poverty after housing costs was about 27%, and it went up to just over 30% by 2017-18. Now look at this. This green line is a single mother, a single parent, but they're usually mothers with children. 62% were in poverty in 2010-11, and 70% were in poverty in 2017-18. Now, work was supposed to be the way out of poverty. So let's look at a lone parent in full-time work. In 2010, 18% of children in such households were in poverty, and that had gone up to 30%. This will damage children's lives and have an adverse impact both on the parents who are living in poverty, but on those children whose early child development will be adversely affected. But I have good news. We've been working with Greater Manchester what's not been happening at the city level has been happening at the national level, has been happening in some cities. Children eligible for free school meals have a lower proportion with a good level of development at age 5. And Manchester did worse than the English average. And over the next 3 years, they closed the gap. And they did it by implementing programs and policies that have been well evaluated and improved early child development for children age 5. The number of workers in poverty increased. Again, work was supposed to be the way out of poverty, and people in work had an increasing rate of poverty, not because they were lazy or feckless, but because they were lowly paid. I showed you an example of regressive policies. Look at this for regressive fiscal policy. This dark green line are working age families with children. And it's the effect of changes to the tax and benefit system that were made in 2015 by deciles of income. So people in the bottom 10% of income, families with children, had a greater than 15% drop in income as a result of those changes to the tax and benefit system. The next decile, a 12% drop. Then the richer you were, the less the drop in income. This looks like the Minister of Finance, what we call the Chancellor of the Exchequer, had an explicit policy to make poor people poorer. Is it any surprise if it was more difficult for them to lead healthy lives? I can't resist showing you this. Tax as a percent of income. Original income is the income you get in the market. And for people at the bottom 10%, and tax is not just income tax, but consumption tax as well, and local taxes. And so for people in the bottom 10%, they pay nearly 90% of their income in tax. Gross income is income in the market plus benefits. And the benefits, the welfare payments, more or less double the income of people in the bottom decile. So then they, quote, only pay about 45% of their income in tax, whereas people at the top pay 35% of their income in tax. So we tax people at the bottom at a higher rate than we tax people at the top. You wouldn't do that in the United States, surely. This is US tax rates by income from Sayers and Zuckman. And you can see it was mildly progressive in 1950 till you get up to the 90th centile and then becomes much more progressive. 1980, there were changes to the tax system. It's a bit more progressive lower down and a bit less progressive than it had been higher up. 2016, the top 400 did quite nicely, thank you. And then your president said he was making the biggest tax change ever. That, of course, was not true, but it did make things better for people at the very top. And if you look at what happened over 1962 to 2018, people in the bottom 50% saw their tax rate go up. What you sportingly call the middle 40% saw their tax rates go up. And then for everybody else, the tax rates went down. And for the richest 400, their rate of tax at 23% is lower than for any other group. So actually, we're not unique in the UK of having a regressive tax system. You seem to manage it quite well. And what's happened in the US is the change in social mobility. For people born in 1940, around 90% could expect to have higher incomes than their parents. And that changed dramatically. So people born in 1984, it's about 50-50 whether they would have higher income than their parents. This has been a change in the American dream. Housing, coming back to the UK, one measure of housing affordability is whether households have to spend more than 1/3 of their income on housing. And for the most deprived 10%, that went up from 28% to nearly 38%. Housing has become less affordable. And the number of households in temporary accommodation has gone up dramatically. We put in our report that 1/3 of families, employed families in England, are one paycheck away from homelessness. And the estimated number of people sleeping rough has tripled in the last 10 years. Pundits, newspaper columnists, and politicians are wringing their hands about violence. Young people involved in knife crime. Happily, we don't have guns in England, but we do have knives. And you can see the least deprived, the most deprived, a social gradient. And rather than wringing their hands about the increase in violence, they might look at what's happened to children's services, the increase in child poverty, the closure of Sure Start children's centres, the closure of youth centres because local government had to make such steep cuts, the failure of supporting poorer people to stay in school. And guess what? Violent crime went up. And the more deprived the neighbourhood, the higher the rate of violent crime. And air pollution, PM10, in cities throughout England, the more deprived quintile has higher exposure to PM10 than the least deprived quintile. I put this in not because the details matter, but because we need to bring the climate change and health equity agendas together. We said that we should ensure 100% of new housing is carbon neutral by 2030, with an increased proportion being either affordable or in the social housing centre, and aim for net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2030, ensuring that inequalities do not widen as a result. One of the drawbacks from our report was that we do not have routine data in the UK on ethnic differences. I come back to the US on the question of structural racism. Look at women first. Black women have lower incomes than white women. When you look at the relation of income of adults to their parents' income, you can see this steep relationship. And the lower income of Black women compared with white women is completely explained, in a sense, by parental income. So you can see that this tight relation, the richer your parents were, the richer you're likely to be because of low levels of social mobility. But parental income more or less predicts the lower income of Black women compared with white women. Now look at the men. The white men have higher income than Black men at every level of parental income. Parental income is not a very good predictor of why white men have higher income than Black men. There's something else going on. And one name for that is racism. Let's look at incarceration. Incarceration rates by parental income for men, this is white men and black men. You can see that for black men, families in the top 1%, their young men have the same incarceration rate as white families earning $36,000 a year. And the lower the parental income, the bigger the disadvantage of being a young black man. And at the very bottom end, the prevalence of incarceration on any one day was 22%. Structural racism. Let me finish by saying, I've talked about public expenditure nationally, locally. Most of the thinking about economic policy is about whether GDP grows or not. What about this? Where might I have got this statement from? A well-being approach can be described as enabling people to have the capabilities they need to live lives of purpose, balance, and meaning for them. Capabilities. Amartya Sen? Well, it could be, but no, it was the New Zealand Treasury, the New Zealand Ministry of Finance. This is the central dogma of the New Zealand Ministry of Finance. A well-being economy described as enabling people to have the capabilities they need to lead lives of purpose, balance, and meaning for them. We can do things in a different way. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Michael. That was, as always, immensely clear and immensely thoughtful. I will open it up for questions, and we'll take questions through the Q&A at the bottom of the screen, but some questions are already coming in. But let me start with a couple of questions myself, if you don't mind. So I was struck by something you said in your talk, which I've often used in some of my talks, but people do not use it enough, where you said the government is actively working to make poorer people poorer, or something like that. I'm paraphrasing. And in some respects, said in a sort of mild way, it sounds non-controversial, but the words are actually quite strong on that. I was wondering if you can comment on that. I was wondering if you can comment on it around the intentionality with which government action is taken and how it deepens these health divides, what it tells us about the governments that we have, and perhaps as importantly or more importantly, what we can do to change that conversation.
Well, it's a good question, and I have no insight, special insight into what goes on in the minds of senior politicians, what they think about in their bedrooms at night. And I was sitting with a former junior minister from the Conservative government, and I showed him those figures. And I said to him, it was your government's policy to make poor people poorer. This is steeply regressive. And he looked uncomfortable. And he said, well, maybe it wasn't the purpose of government policy. I said, but there are some very clever people in Her Majesty's Treasury. This was the predictable effect of government policy. So even if it wasn't the stated purpose, you must have known, the Chancellor must have known that that's the effect of his policy. And this former minister, a decent person, looked uncomfortable. So he couldn't give me a good answer. Whether you can speculate, I can speculate as to what went on in the minister's mind. He's a politician, so it won't take you too long to jump to a conclusion as to why he didn't care if poor people were poorer. That he could justify it. I mean, one way of justifying it would be to say, oh, we decided to make it equal funding per person. regardless of deprivation. Now that sounds lovely, doesn't it? Equal funding per person. But that's not taking need into account. I talk about proportionate universalism. And that means we want universal policies with effort proportionate to need. And what I showed you were policies that contradicted that were moving in the other direction. But I can't, with any confidence, talk to the intentionality of exactly why they did it. But I can tell you what they did and the likely effect of it.
Can you comment, an extension of that, can you comment a little bit whether, not whether, how this audience can best contribute to changing a public health conversation that does not allow that kind of political action? I'm just curious. I mean, you have been, to my mind, so deeply influential on all of us, which means that you bring enormous experience to this. But what can the academic public health community do and do better to change what it is we talk about when we talk about health?
Well, I'd like to think, I mean, everything's changed because of the pandemic, but if we go back to another era in history, that is 3 weeks ago, I think certainly in the UK, and my Indian colleagues tell me in India, and I know from the Twitter account, 14 people in New Zealand tuned in. I probably know their names. I know that we captured a mood because in a dispassionate way, based on the evidence, we showed what the likely effect was of government policies on the lives people are able to lead, and hence health and health equity. And I think as a public health community, that's what we need to do. I'm not very good on a soapbox, screaming political slogans. It's not my métier. It maybe suits some people more. I think we need a dispassionate analysis, like I hope we did in our tenure on review, and say, you pursued certain policies. It is highly likely that health got worse and health inequalities got bigger as a result of your policies. If you care about the health of the population, we've given you the ammunition, the evidence to change policies. Here you are, we're giving you the opportunity to improve society and improve the health of its members, and we'll help you. Now go and do it.
Let me ask you one more question before I turn to questions from the audience.
Please.
Can you comment about the myth that poor people behave poorly? And I thought you showed the data, which I had not seen you present before, which I thought was very compelling, that 75% of, for poor people, 75% of income would be needed to meet healthy eating guidelines, which I thought was a really lovely illustration of the challenge with the myth that poor people behave poorly. I was wondering if you can comment on what you have found to be the most effective way to combat that narrative. In the US, because of our dramatic polarization between right and left, red and blue, essentially half the argument is always, well, poor people are bringing it upon themselves. And I'm just wondering if you can comment on what you have found to be most effective to push back at the personal choice behaviorist argument that clearly is not borne out by the data.
Well, consistent with what I said in response to your last question, I tried to intrude on that argument with data and evidence, like the evidence I just showed you. If you think it's a matter of poor choices, look at this. Look at housing. People aren't living in poor quality housing or in temporary accommodation out of choice. They're living in poor quality housing or temporary accommodation because they can't afford to live in better accommodation. I mean, I had somebody from the choice side of the argument, an American colleague. We were at a meeting somewhere and she said, I don't want the government telling me what to do. And I said, when you checked into this meeting place, did you ask for the hotel room with asbestos or the one without asbestos? And she looked at me I said, weren't you happy to have the choice made for you that none of the rooms had asbestos in? Well, of course I was happy. Well then, right, now we've established the principle. We expect that certain conditions do affect health without individual choice, and we accept that idea. So why would you think it's somebody's fault for not eating healthy food if they can't afford to eat healthy food? And why would you imagine that if somebody's ground down by poverty and they're a single mother, and you say, you know, you really should read bedtime stories to your children, it would be good for their development, that mother might say, if I was sure I would have a bed, then I'd read bedtime stories. But as I've only got insecure accommodation, I'm not really quite in a position to do that. And I can go through domain after domain after domain and show the evidence that this is not simply a matter of people making poor choices. It's the circumstances in which they find themselves that's conditioning their choices. And I try and do it based on evidence.
So I'm going to go to questions from the audience. I'm going to go out of sequence just to build on this conversation. Let me start with this question, which says that there's often a sense that when talking about people most affected by poverty, we are talking over those same people, not including them in the conversation. What's the best way to use these data to inform individuals affected by poverty so they can actually use their own voices?
Well, when we launched our report in London, a colleague stood up and said he had been working with deprived communities. And I had started by saying, I thought that people thought about health as a matter of access to health care. And they didn't really understand the social determinants of health. And this colleague said, the communities I work with do understand the social determinants of health. And the argument is that empowering communities is good at different levels. It's good because empowerment per se is likely to improve health, but it's good because then people from outside, including people like me, are not coming along and imposing solutions that may not fit with the community. So we know we need policies that set the right framework, but then we need to work with communities to empower them to get the kind of solutions that fit with the particular nature of the community that's being affected.
Let me change tack for a second and talk about race ethnicity. The question is, race and ethnicity are charged issues in the US, and I realize they're also in the UK, in the US perhaps more so. You are, you've been an excellent expositor of the role of race ethnicity in these kind of gaps. But how do we navigate that controversy, the sensitivity around it? Should we, to what extent should we be weaving in race ethnicity with vital statistics data? What would be your way of bringing together the importance of highlighting health gaps by these axes with the sensitivities around them?
Well, it's a good question, and I can't pretend to have a complete answer to a question like that, because if we knew the answer, you might say we'd be doing it. But what we see when we examine the data by race and ethnicity is that, in general, at the top of the social economic spectrum, there are smaller differences by race and ethnicity than there are at the bottom. It's in a way analogous to what I showed for region within England, that the disadvantage of being deprived is bigger if you're black than white, or to put it another way, the disadvantage of being African American is bigger if you're deprived than if you're not. And so policies can make a difference. And we kind of know what those policies are. Now, we can't necessarily, I mean, one of the distressing things about the US over the last 3 3.5 years, is that somehow it's been made legitimate to bring racism out of the closet. One can't say that racism has increased, but it's become more overt, which is a significant step backwards. Because we know policies make a difference. When you have a Civil Rights Act, that makes a difference. When you have a Voting Rights Act, that makes a difference. So we know policies make a difference. They don't necessarily by themselves change hearts and minds, but they do make a difference. And we know when we see people of African American ethnicity, Hispanic, Asians, people who have good social and economic advantage thrive under those conditions. And people who don't. So we know policies make a difference. And I'd like to think they help change the conversation and the attitudes too.
Can you comment a bit on equity assessments? The Congressional Budget Office in the US has made use of this. To what extent is it feasible, advisable to agitate for equity assessments to infuse policymaking broadly?
Well, look at those figures I showed you for local government spending. If you did a proper health equity analysis, accountability, you would not have regressive policies like that. And it should be right out there. We should be discussing it. It should be there. The government should have the courage of its convictions. We think poor communities should be deprived of funding. So we're going to make bigger cuts to poor communities because that's what we want to do. Have the courage of your convictions. If you're going to do that, come out and say that you're doing it. And if you think it's the right thing to do, justify it. But don't sneak it in and pretend you're doing something else. So I think equity assessments are vital because if you do an equity assessment, you're actually doing a health equity assessment.
Can we build on that and talk about the current moment? Let's talk about the current moment. Can you talk a little bit from your perspective about the measures that were being put in place right now, how those are going to affect equity and health equity in the short and medium term? And of course, a part of that is what, from your perspective, is the best way to mitigate the current moment contributing to widening health gaps?
Well, so I know the UK data better than the US data, of course, but it's analogous in the US. In the UK, if you look at low and middle income earners, so people in the bottom 50% of the earnings distribution, half have no savings at all, none at all. The bottom half of people, so half the people in the bottom half have no savings, and 75% have £3,000 or less, $3,500 or less. That means that if they're laid off, they have no cushion at all. No cushion at all. If you look at those people in the bottom half of the distribution, they are 5 times more likely than people in the top half to have jobs that make it impossible to work at home. It's just not an option if you're in the bottom half. If you're one of the 4.7 million people in the gig economy, one of the 6 million people in catering and retail, you can't work at home. You can't work at home if you're in hospitality, catering, or retail. So that means either you're going to be more likely to be exposed to the virus, or with the downturn in economic activity, you're going to be laid off. Well, you've got no savings to speak of. And unless we do something, and in fact, what's interesting is, in a way, what's being discussed in the US and possibly in Britain is a form of universal basic income. Give everyone $1,000, give everyone $2,000.
Absolutely.
It's a form of UBI, of saying, look, the economy is going to go down the plug hole, because if people have no money, they can't consume. So they won't, it's not just that they won't be going to restaurants and bars and clubs and the like, but they won't be buying clothes and they won't be buying anything. So this is a really dangerous time. And most of the impact will be felt lower down in the social hierarchy. And I'll give you one figure that I just saw today in the New York Times, that in New York City, 1 in 10 school children are homeless. Close the schools, send them home, but they're homeless. They're in temporary accommodation. What is that going to do to them, the children? And you're going to have online teaching, perhaps, that assumes that everybody's able to get online. So if you go right through my 5 domains that we covered in the 10-year on report, I think each of those 5 will be adversely affected by the current changes because of the crisis, and will have bigger effects the lower down you are in the social economic hierarchy.
You've been writing about this for for decades, and compellingly and with data, and as have others. But in some respects, the global political movements have lately been electing governments that are perhaps directly antithetical to thinking progressively about narrowing health gaps. So I was wondering if you can comment. You can comment on the moment, and perhaps what do you think it will take to turn the corner on these stories that you have been telling so compellingly for so long?
Well, if we roll the clock back a month or 2 before the current pandemic crisis, I certainly have good reason to believe that the understanding of the social determinants of health and health equity was growing in all sorts of circles: academic, healthcare, activists. I mean, to give you one example, and you notice I'm shying away from the political question for the moment, but to give you one example, again from the UK, in the medical professions, it's difficult to get gynecologists, internal medicine specialists, and the like to be thinking about social determinants and health equity. Virtually all of the medical royal colleges, the Royal College of Physicians, psychiatrists, surgeons, pediatrics and child health, general practitioners, the Royal College of Nursing, they got together. They wrote an open letter to the Prime Minister. They urged him to act on my 10 years on report, and announced that these medical royal colleges were setting up a Health Inequalities Alliance. Now they're very powerful. They're very powerful. They have a very important voice. It's not easy for a Prime Minister simply to ignore them. Now, at the moment, we're in such a bizarre, unusual time that everything gets lost. But this moment won't last forever. So I think we've got more voices that are recognizing social determinants of health and health equity, and we will rely on those voices to put pressure on the politicians. But what we also need is that our social movement among academics, activists, health workers, and the like spreads more widely to the general population.
That's hopeful. I like that. Totally separate topic. Somebody's asking about private-public partnerships. Can you talk about your take on public-private partnerships, and can you think of specific examples where they've improved health of particular communities?
I can think of good examples where they've been a disaster. Mm-hmm. I can think of less good examples where they've improved health. So we, for example, in Britain, went down the line of public-private partnerships in hospital building. And what that means what that meant essentially was that the government gave secured loans, so it was virtually risk-free for the private sector to invest in hospitals and then have a guaranteed income for the next 20 years or so. And you think, who really benefited from that? Who really benefited from that? It really didn't work very well. So I can think of good examples where it hasn't worked. Now, in fact, there are examples in the UK where there are public-private partnerships in house building, where local authorities who did have social housing have brought into private companies or housing associations, which are somewhere in between public and private, and they work together. And that seems to have been quite successful in housing. But in hospital building, it's not been good. And we've got some bizarre version of charter schools going on in the UK. And that's a very odd way to run our education system.
Let me ask you the last question. Can you comment a little bit about changing global economies and how have the forces of a greater global interconnectedness, changing global economies, globalization, affected health gaps, let's say within the UK and the US? And to what extent is there a trade-off with health gaps widening and narrowing in other countries?
What we know in the UK, broadly speaking, The Economist magazine, or as they call themselves, newspaper, they did an interesting analysis after the Brexit vote, the Brexit referendum. And the areas of the UK, according to The Economist's calculation, that were most affected by Chinese imports were more likely to vote to leave the European Union. Wow. In other words, areas that were left behind by globalization were in a state of justifiable dissatisfaction. They took it out in a rather random way, because how on earth their lives would be improved by voting to leave the European Union, nobody quite spelled out. But to the extent that leaving the European Union will have an adverse impact on the lives of those people, they've actually voted to make themselves worse off. And you could argue the same thing happened with the 2016 presidential election in the United States. People who were left behind globally in the US were more likely to vote for a president who was most unlikely to do anything to improve their lives. And that means likely to increase inequalities.
Sir Michael, I want to say thank you. And thank you on behalf of the audience. Thank you on behalf of ASPPH for joining us. And perhaps more importantly, thank you for everything you're doing, particularly in this time. I quite liked your reference to this moment shall pass, and which I think it will as well. And it seems to me like it elevates our responsibility to keep doing what we are doing, so that when the moment passes, so both during the moment we mitigate the harms for health equity and are positioned to use the moment well towards improving the world after it. So thank you for giving us the tools to do that.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Everybody in the audience, thank you for joining us. The recording will be available, as you'll see, online, and you'll also see that there are the upcoming other ASPPH annual meeting virtual events, including a seminar that will be starting in just a couple of minutes. Thank you, everybody. Enjoy the rest of the day. I hope everybody stays safe and stays well during these times. Thank you again, Sir Michael.
My pleasure. Bye-bye.